The goal of a game developer is to fabricate an entirely false reality and immerse you in it. So of course they're not telling you some things, but some of it actually ends up looking a little sinister. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 dark secrets revealed by game makers. Now, before we get going, the games industry can be a dark place. There's a lot of bad stuff going on. That's not what we're talking about today. The dark secrets I want to discuss are more like funny or weird glitches left in the game that come off a little bit ominous, I think is a good word. Maybe a little malevolent, even. So, starting off at number 10, it's a 1080p trick for Wipeout HD. Back when the PS3 was still new, getting games to run at 1080p wasn't always easy. The expectation was for games to have cutting-edge visuals and a solid frame rate, which is still a challenge for a lot of many game developers, even now. The PS3 was especially difficult to develop for because of its code base, which is notoriously impenetrable. It has exotic hardware that used 7 floating coprocessors. It was all meant to be very cutting edge, but it was more of a challenge than anything else for developers. Wipeout 3 HD was a game that seemed to beat the PS3 curse. It was an HD game that ran at a consistent 60 frames per second with no drops. At least that's how it appears. In reality, the game would actually switch between resolutions using the console's hardware scaler. It was basically a form of dynamic resolution scaling that we see in games today, but without any of the frame skips or visual messiness you'd see with that kind of technology even then. What makes Wipeout HD unique, at least according to this Eurogamer article from Digital Foundry, is that the game has a dynamic frame buffer which keeps the frame rate high and masks the dynamic resolution changes. Keep in mind, the devs did all this stuff before technology like DLSS and frame generation were common. This was all very cutting edge. It's easy to look at this and shrug your shoulders because it's really common now. But on the PS3, this is basically conjuring dark magic. In all seriousness, it was incredibly impressive. And I remember Wipeout 3 HD going, how in the hell does this look so much better than everything else? At number 9, the real reason they have all those opening logos and tiles, that endless parade of boring logos, warnings, disclaimers. You ever wonder why you get that when you boot up a new game? Well, there's the boring answer that a lot of that stuff is mandated by the publisher and any partners involved in making the game. But if you want something a little darker, look no further than a comment made by a developer posting anonymously in one of those game dev Q&A type forum threads. This, along with Reddit, are where I'm getting all this from, and a lot of this information can't be verified, so understand it's not confirmed, so take it with a grain of salt. That goes for the entire list, in fact. I'm working with what I have, people. But there's a user named Shownuff. He responds to a question about long opening movies by talking about their experience working on an unnamed Xbox original game. Apparently, this game would actually install the internal hard drive at startup, which was unheard of at the time and actually a violation of Xbox's TRC, or Technical Requirements Checklist. Basically, they were not supposed to do that. This caused such a stink that Ed Fries, Microsoft's VP of game publishing at the time, came down to yell at them about it. And how did they fix it? Well, by removing the install screen and saying that the licensor is making us hold on this frame for about 20 seconds. That's all they did, and somehow they got away with it. I doubt games mostly have long intros because they're secretly installed without telling you, but hey, if one game did it, who's to say? At number 8, Halo Infinite still has marathon code in it. This one's pretty wild. I've heard of games retaining code from old games, like how modern Call of Duty games still have some Quake code in there. But this goes even further back. In a Reddit thread on rGameDev, a user who claims to have worked on Halo 5 named Randy Knapp asserts that 343 Studios was so deathly afraid of losing the Halo feel that they basically refused to revamp the aging Halo engine. According to him, the code is a mess of multiple different scripting languages stitched together. It was so bad that they went so far to say, I can't believe any Halo game ever shipped. The thing that really shocked me is just how far back the remnants of the Halo code go. As the user puts it, there is code in the engine that goes all the way back to one of Bungie's first games, Marathon, from 1992. It gets worse. Another user named Chipsnapper chimed in, mentioning the code for C-Series appears in a few headers in Halo Infinite, which comes from Convergent Series, which was a name the founders of Bungie came up with before calling it Bungie. There is code in Halo Infinite that is older than Bungie's entire existence. Now that's tech debt. At number 7, silence is golden. Some of the most eerie glitches are the ones hiding in plain sight, as described by Keith Kaiserschott, a programmer from Digital Eclipse, for a gamedeveloper.com article. There was a persistent bug in the Mega Man Legacy Collection where the first sound that got played would get horribly garbled or just not play properly. As usual with stories about game development, they were aware of the issue but never found the actual cause of it because they just ran out of time. But they couldn't ship the game with a bug like that. It messes up the first sound of the game, so they came up with a clever solution. They just inserted 1 second of sound before the opening title, which was completely silent. Problem solved. It's a clever solution, but it's kind of weird. And game devs can just insert inaudible sound files in the games whenever they want. Any of these games could easily be sending us subliminal messages at any time. We just don't know it. People would obviously know about it. Guys go through the game files all the time. And everyone knows at this point that subliminal messages are kind of bunk. They're bunk, right? Right? It's a funny scenario to imagine, though. And number 6, sometimes games lie to you about settings. Another interesting little revelation from gamedeveloper.com, this time from a Remy Queenan, who doesn't say what this game is from. Honestly, doesn't matter a whole lot. I looked it up, and it's not anything really noteworthy, but the actual secret's a little sinister, not gonna lie. So here's what happened. They were working on an RTS game from around 2007. Everything was going smoothly into the last day before the deadline to send in the Gold Master CD for printing. At that point, they realized that the German language translation was making the game too big. They had planned for all the languages to be about the same size, but German took longer, and it made the total file size of the translation just a little too big. They had less than a day to figure out how to squeeze out the space to make everything fit, and their solution was, pretty deceptive. This game had texture quality settings, pretty standard stuff back then. And if you know anything about game development, you know how much space high-res textures take up. So they were looking at their levels and just deleted the high-resolution textures and replaced them with the medium-resolution textures. It's only in Germany, but if you're playing the game on maxed-out settings, there will be one level that looks conspicuously worse, even if you got all your settings switched to high. It's an ingenious solution, but it calls the entire graphics selection menu into question. Can any of these sliders and settings actually be trusted now? And number 5 is the just off-screen frame rate counter. So just one more from GameDeveloper.com. This one comes from Martin Turton, talking about a port of a PS2 and PSP version of a racing game. Basically, the handling on their versions of the games didn't feel right according to QA, but the developers just didn't notice a difference. They spent weeks trying to hunt down the reason why the game felt different to play before they noticed the developer build of the game had a frame rate counter while the QA version didn't. After some testing, they realized that was the problem. When the frame rate counter was there, the game performed how it was supposed to, and when it wasn't, the handling was wrong. Without proper time to fix the root problem, they just threw up their hands and left the frame rate counter on the screen, but moved it just out of the visible play area. Even if it's something as benign as that, there's something a little weird and unsettling about UI developments just being outside of your viewable range. It's always there, like the ghost in PT, you just never know it. That's over dramatic, but it's kind of weird. Also, what the hell is that? There are few bugs I have heard of that make that little amount of sense. At number 4, characters with tiny information boards in them that allow them to speak. In an r/game dev thread about the dumbest shortcut you've ever taken as a game dev, a user by the name of I Am Not a British Spy had an especially interesting answer to that question. They never revealed what game it is they actually worked on, but it was a quote-unquote semi-popular platformer. All was going smoothly in development, as these things tend to go, but with less than 2 weeks before their final deadline, a shareholder came up with a brilliant idea that the characters should be able to speak. They had less than 2 weeks left developing the game. There was no time to come up with a whole new dialogue system, so instead of working harder, they worked smarter. The game already had a system where you could read information boards for hints, so they just took those boards, shrunk them down, and put them inside NPCs, so whenever you talk to somebody in the game, you're really just reading a tiny information board masquerading as a character. The informations for the lore are staggering for whatever game this is. I wish I knew, but after some searching, I couldn't pin down exactly what it was. Maybe you guys have the answer. I'm genuinely curious. At number 3, the Wii resets constantly. You probably heard about Morrowind on the Xbox and how it actually silently reboots the console while loading as a way to get around memory constraints, right? Well, you're hearing about it now. but it was one of those stories that was all over the place a few years back. What you might not know is that it was not the only piece of game software doing this. Apparently, at least according to comments on this Hackaday article, this isn't coming from the developers themselves because Nintendo is notoriously tight-lipped about pretty much everything they do behind the scenes, but the people who post on this site tend to be modders or hackers who understand the inner workings of consoles like this, and I'm inclined to trust them. According to user DL Carrier, the Wii has a crazy number of reboots. And it's not just when, loading a game. Simply switching between menus can necessitate multiple reboots, which does explain why the Wii can feel a little slow switching between menus sometimes. A guy named Potato further explains that each program on the Wii is basically its own operating system. Damn Tech follows up by explaining that the Wii has several little operating systems they call iOSs. Because they're literally each separate operating system rather than programs, the Wii is forced to reset every time you load into a different one. It's so weird that a system is just doing something this drastic without us knowing it. In reality, it's a pretty common practice for a lot of things that were lacking in system memory. Arcade cabinets reset all the time and it wasn't anything to worry about. Still, knowing this kind of puts me on edge about turning on the Wii. What else is it doing and not telling me about? And number 2, when treasure chests are actually people. It's bad enough that you have to deal with mimics. Now you're telling me that treasure chests are also people? Oh, come on. In this R game dev thread for the dumbest shortcuts you've ever taken as game dev, a user named Trottom said something interesting about the treasure chests. Basically, only one level of the game had chests in them, so instead of making an entirely new script for opening a chest, they made chests that are just enemies that can't move, and their only attack was a close-range melee that would always miss you, but hit themselves with splash damage, enough to make the chest disappear and leave a reward. That's kind of disturbing, right? But on top of that, another user named Zeppish added in something even stranger. There are 3 treasures that appear post-game in Earthbound, the quirky SNES cult favorite RPG. But because the game can't actually make new chests appear in places, these new chests are just people who say Ness opened the treasure box when you talk to them and give you an item. Just imagine being one of those NPCs, forever trapped in a single location, aware of your own existence but unable to speak or do anything but give the main character an item when they talk to you. It'd be the worst episode of Black Mirror ever made. And finally, at number 1, the code is probably a disaster. It cannot be understated how big of a mess the code of most games are. I'm not talking about complicated or confusing. I mean like next level incantations to get anything to work type stuff. Many of the developers on r/GameDev talk about their prior experience working with messy games in this thread about a secret people should know about. But the part that really interested me starts with user Gluteus Maximu, who gets the ball rolling talking about messed up code in games. There are some amazing replies here, like from Mr. Grady Sir, who talks about the code that has the comment, "This function doesn't do anything at all, but if you remove it, nothing will work. Do not remove it like the 20 developers before you tried to do." They actually took the time to try to figure out what the function was, and it actually did nothing. Even though it was code that literally didn't do anything, if you removed it, the entire game would fall apart. A perfect example of this kind of nonsense comes from Chris Wingard, a guy who worked at EA. A NASCAR game, they didn't specify which one, required that a field goal post be placed under the world because if they took it out, it would break the game. The NASCAR game, by the way, was built using old Madden code, and somehow it came to be that if the game didn't have a field goal, the game would not function. So when people say making games is hard and that trying to fix bugs can be sometimes almost impossible, I am inclined to believe them. You might as well be trying to predict the future with chicken blood or something. It makes about as much sense as some of these game engines do. Don't even get me started about the fact that Bethesda is still running Gamebryo, a 1990s engine. Yeah, they call it the Creation Engine, but Starfield is still running on this engine. I got a couple of bonuses for you as well. NBA Jam had this ridiculous save game lie. It was revealed by Chris Kirby, a developer on NBA Jam Tournament Edition on Sega Genesis. They'd already ordered 250,000 game carts from the manufacturer before realizing the game's save system was completely broken. Midway, the game's current publisher, understandably freaked out because they had just ordered thousands of game carts that were essentially broken. They tried multiple methods to get the game to work, including manually adding hardware to every cart to fix them, but nothing worked. The devs did manage to find a solution. You had to play the games in a very odd and specific order, and the save system would sort of work. What did they do? They added some extra instructions in the box explaining how to get the save system to work and called it a feature, which is real marketing, folks. And finally, Wing Commander. Thanks for playing. We've talked about this one before, but it's funny as hell. It was explained by Ken Demarest from Origin Software. Basically, every time they'd exit the game out of DOS, an error code would pop up. You don't want your game basically crashing every time you exit it, so they tried to fix it, but couldn't come up with a solution, so they just tricked everyone instead. So they couldn't solve the problem. What did they do? They just changed the error message. Instead of reading EMM386 Memory Manager error, which, if you remember the DOS era, whoa, you remember EMM386 errors, they just changed it to say, thank you for playing Wing Commander, which is freaking brilliant, because at this point, you're done with the game. It doesn't matter that there was an EMM386 Memory Manager error. Honestly, the slickest and funniest possible solution. Well, that's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications. And as always, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero. We'll see you next time right here on gameranx.